G'day legends, I hope that you're having a fantastic day and so far a fantastic week and that you're looking after yourself. Now today as always we have a lot to go over. We need to look at the maps, we need to look at geolocations, we need to look where there is a lot of fighting. Now we're going to put all that together, but one thing I've seen a lot of where I think some people's analysis of situations can be a little bit off skew is the non-acceptance of an attritional war, and taking that large losses therefore mean strategic failure. But what you really need to look at in these losses is that replacement rate being met, and what is the strategic gain of those losses meeting then that success or failure of that calculation. That is a very important piece, that calculation we need to put together, and we're going to look at recruitment and mobilization and attacks of both Russia and Ukraine and put that all together. We need to look over a Financial Times article about offensives, new Russian offensives that may take place, and the reality of what actually is occurring on the ground. The struggles that Russia's running into, the struggles that Ukraine is also up against, and really what will break first. This is the period of war I believe we're in, is just what is looking like it will break first. And then I want to talk about at length nuclear weapons. I want to look at the advantages of nuclear weapons, the disadvantages of them, and talk about how nuclear weapons are used every single day. Of course, ones aren't exploding, but great powers use these as a tool of influence, of coercion, every single day. Now, as you'll be aware, I had my meeting with my oncologist yesterday. Now, my old oncologist, he had retired, and bless him, I hope that he is sipping a cocktail on a beach somewhere, enjoying his retirement. People that devote such a massive portion of their life to looking after people suffering with cancers deserve everything in the world. Greatly unappreciated. If they wanted money, they'd go into plastic surgery or something more sexy, but I couldn't thank him enough, and how he looked after me last time I did chemo, and his recommendation for this oncologist as well seems like a fantastic and competent bloke too. Now, if you're sitting in a little bit of limbo, if you get that feeling of I don't know what's going on, I don't know what's going on either. We're still waiting on these molecular results to come back, and that will tell us, are we just doing chemo, or are we doing chemo and radiotherapy, or anything in between? I have no idea. I'm really struggling with the idea of doing chemo again, and it sort of dawned on me just the months that I've got ahead of me, and I really need to ask of, how much time do you think this is going to give me extra? Because if it gives me a year extra, but it's taking away a year of my life for that treatment, I'm not taking that bloody poison. So I do need to have more of a think about that. But let's have a look at the map today. So of course, here is Ukraine in the center of your screen, the capital of Kyiv. The red areas occupied since 22, the purple, of course, since 2014. Now, where I want to come into, the red check is ground that Russia has moved in the past 24 hours. That's what we'll be looking at today. So where I want to come is into Kupyansk. Now, we see this red check of where Russia has made ground, but the most interesting part is the grey zone here that comes all the way along this road into the center of Kupyansk. There was a Russian armoured movement all the way out into here. And now this is very difficult to get an idea of if this was a success or failure from the footage, from the sources of the footage, and how this can be cut up also. But again, like with everything in life, time will tell us. So if Russia is able to hold a successful area in here and the red zone moves up, we can see that if it's met replacement, that then it was a success. If not, we can see that it was a failure. And many, many times we hear that these attacks are a failure because there was large losses. But I think people aren't taking into account this is attritional war. Having huge losses is part of it. Sadly, it's brutal. I don't want any part of that at all, but that is part of it. And this is a pill we're going to have to swallow if we ever step into protracted attritional war. It is the acceptance of large losses, and also the acceptance too that there is going to be drone footage, video footage of absolutely horrible things happening as well, shared incredibly public. But let's have a look over what has occurred in here. Now, geolocations I've got from a couple of different sources. This is from Creamy Caprice, showing a very similar area as to where the grey zone is in here. And then this was off another page, I can't remember, but this is where I put it too. So write down where that grey zone is. So let's have a look at this Russian armoured movement into, of course, Kupyansk. Now, Kupyansk, you need to remember, is a very important hub for the northeast of Ukraine's fight at the moment. And you can see some MTLBs and tanks moving through here and some strikes as they move through these forests. The more concern with this is that they were able to actually just move that 4 kilometres. It's between 3.8 and 4 kilometres that these vehicles have moved with relatively little resistance. Now, these vehicles are accompanied with a tank as well. There was a couple of columns here, have moved into these houses and dismounted troops. And that is about as far as we know, that there were dismounted infantry in here. And we don't know, maybe overnight Russia will send in more columns and able to get a foothold into here. But what I've said, Russia has this sort of paint by numbers attack at the moment. It is getting areas on the flanks, but then it is hitting with the FABs, then it is TOS, and then recon elements, or either mounted on motorcycles or mounted on lighter armoured vehicles. And maybe we're at that part. It will be very interesting to see what happens here, or if this was a failure and we see the grey zone decrease across here. So let's look then at what Deep State, of course, a Ukrainian source said. Russians flew into Kupyansk in parade mode. Today in the afternoon, 2 columns of enemy vehicles advanced from this district in Kupyansk to the road of Svatov. The first consisted of 2 MTLBs, a BMP and a tank. The exact composition of the second column is unknown because they were already moving when it got dark. One MTLB was shot down in the forest. The other managed to get to the area of the street we saw unhindered, go for a walk, and then they drove to this street. It was already hit. 1.5 dozen gifts poured out. So we're talking, I'm not exactly sure how many they're meaning here. 1.5 dozen. I'm thinking it's going to be 18 soldiers poured out. It was knocked out in the same street, the tank that was with that first unit, and then it was possible to destroy part of the landing party. So this tells to me that there's still potentially some Russian landing infantry in this area. The enemy knows about his success, so he tried to send reinforcements, which were hit. So try, come into here and reinforce where they'd made it up to. Why did this situation arise? In recent months, the line of contact has become a mystery for all units. The combat formations of the armed forces and enemy were simply scattered in the forest. Rotations of both sides were carried out, and the war in the forest looked strange. So just a confusion in here, and that can happen. I have a friend of mine who was working as a reporter who was going, I'll just film at the next checkpoint I see. It'll be the last checkpoint Ukraine will let me through. Pulls up to a checkpoint, winds down the window, and there's a guy with fucking Z on his body armour. Luckily, he got turned around, but he gave him the fright of his life. Now, let's measure this. About that 3.8 to 4 kilometres that I said back behind the line. But let's look at what some other pages are saying. Let's look at what AMK mapping has said. Russia has broken through Ukrainian lines in Kupyansk and entered the city. I'm telling you, Sinkivka was the key to this. Many of you remember the Russian columns attacking the direction of Sinkivka and being destroyed over and over again. And I'll say the exact same I said earlier, and I'll say what I've said about Vuhledar. We see these attacks again and again being destroyed and Russia throwing men at something. But like Vuhledar, potentially like Sinkivka, that level of attrition, and then at some point it holds and there is success, and then we can see a large area. Like Vuhledar, Russia had no real square meter change in Vuhledar for like 12 months, and potentially thousands of guys then lay in the mud there. But once it was broken through, it's been a dozen kilometres, around 12 kilometres was made beyond that. And that is part of attritional war. The question is more, can the Russian economy, can the Russian recruitment keep up with these losses that are occurring? They're very hard questions to get answers to. Once that village fell, only a small river lay in the way. This wasn't expected, but I'm surprised how sudden it occurred. It's possible that Ukraine left the northern Oskil bridgehead altogether once the Russians cut off this area down in here. So the whole bridgehead across in this sector, potentially how this is getting cut off of the Oskil. Will we see a closing up of territory as well? I guess we will see. Let's look at what then Suryak has said. Now, Suryak does show the same movement in here that Deep State does, but he only shows an arrow out in here, not that the red has moved, but speaks about the landing of troops took place in the vicinity of the private area, centre of the industrial. It remains unclear whether Russian troops were able to gain a foothold in the area. If this is confirmed, we're talking about the beginning of a battle for this city. So we will see, and we will say also what was the goal behind this movement into here. One of the biggest problems I see a lot of analysts do is they go, oh, it's just crazy Russian command barbarians. Just go that way and in. If you minimize everything to that, you may miss other sectors and go, well, don't underestimate your enemy. And what are they doing here? Why has that occurred? Why have they been allowed to go in here? What intel do they have, or X, Y, and Z to carry out that assault? So we will see what becomes of this in the coming days, weeks. Well, by tomorrow we should have an answer if there's soldiers still there or not. So let's look at Kursk. Of course, what I brought up yesterday was Russia's pouring a lot of columns into here, a lot of fighters into here to try and retake areas. Ukraine in here is pouring some of their better systems and better soldiers into here to attempt to hold this area today, and we don't see any changes on this map. One thing I'll say about Kursk is I believe strategically and tactically this has very little overall strategic and tactical value for Russia and Ukraine, at least in when we're talking square kilometres, that it's more political. I believe on the Russian side, they don't want to be seen as Ukraine occupying any of their territory. But if you're talking pure numbers, Russia occupy 110,000 square kilometres. This is between 400 and maybe 550 square kilometres. In a negotiation, that's going to be fairly irrelevant. But on the other side, on the Ukrainian side, that they don't want to have to pull out of here, say that was a mistake, and how that could affect morale or psychological aspect, as well as wanting cards on the table. So I believe it has more political value than pure military, strategic or tactical value. The problem that has become in here, I believe, is that I believe if Ukraine were to pull out of here, if they need to reinforce that east, and Russia has got 50,000 heavily armoured soldiers in here, what is stopping them from then pushing back across into Sumy Oblast and creating a whole nother problem? Anyway, let's talk about this area. So you can see on the Syriac maps some different areas in here. So you can look then around Ulyanok and where ground is being made. So if we zoom in just a little bit, you'll have Ulyanok. Now this is sort of the opposite of what we're used to seeing, if that makes sense, because the red here is Russian territory. It's the same, but it can be difficult to get a piece on. I think you know what I mean. So around Ulyanok, Kurakhove, where it's saying that Russia is having some level of advancements, but also on the western side here as well around Deathonomics too. They're saying there is some movement to and from, and even potential of maybe a cut off of some of the troops that are sitting out in here by the Ukrainian forces. Again, we will wait and see for some geolocations. Kursk, whether it was Ukrainian advancement, whether it's Russian advancement, on either way, it's hard to get an idea of what is going on in here because this is such a politically sensitive area for both Russia and Ukraine. Some of the information is very, very difficult to try and decipher out of here. So let's pull down just a little bit, and we have really the main sector at the moment, which is the Kurakhove front. And as you can see, that on multiple axes in here, Russia has made ground, of course, to the northwest of Prodove, Ilininka, and Dalny also. Now we know this movement around Ilininka has been made by some footage. So if you have a look, this is where the geolocation is, right about where my cursor is right there. We see a flag planted by the Russian forces near the end of this video, also with some assaults and some prisoners look like they are taken as well. What I showed you yesterday was that a Ukrainian Leopard 2A4 did strike successfully a Russian column heading towards Dalny. But like I said earlier in this video, sometimes people get a little bit pigeonholed in their vision on, oh, these losses therefore means a fail. But you can see today, and this is what we see again and again, large losses, but here the front line has moved. This is where that calculation of is the attrition of soldiers in battle meeting replacement. That is where you can measure the success or not, because we are seeing that grind forward at large cost. But is that cost being covered? But it was a Leopard 2A4 that engaged that. There's other footage being shared around the Russian pages of that same Leopard 2A4 looking like it has struck a civilian vehicle and a civilian house. I'm sure you can find that if you'd like to see it somewhere. It's hard to get an idea of, but what we see here is we know there are Leopard 2A4s working here, but Russian page today have shared footage, said to be over the last 24 hours, of 2 Leopard 2A4s being struck by Russian Lancet loitering drones as well in this area, potentially the one that took out that Russian column in here yesterday. So you can just see the savage brutality of war in this sector, but also in that footage you can see where those defensive lines are in here that are under threat at the moment of being flanked. Now, let's just come down south west of here a little bit, Samorsky, Novodonetsky, that where Russia made some ground as well. Then we'll come up into Toretsk, New York front. Now, no change shown on this map, and I believe the reason no change is shown on this map today, I believe, is because it never showed where the Russian advancement was. So what we got from Surak a while back was that Russia had moved all the way up near Lerdenivka as well out from Zalizny. Now, the thing is on this map is it shows no change, but it does show Surak saying that Ukraine had successful counteroffensives in here. But what I'll say is I believe because this was never shown, it can't show that Ukraine actually had successful counter attacks in here on 2 axes, and Russia made some more ground into Toretsk and in some other areas near Dashne, as well as this grinds very slowly through Toretsk. But I still believe that is a second or third priority. The first is down around Kurakhove at the moment, and potentially we'll see what is occurring around Kupyansk. Now, I speak about nuclear weapons a lot as it is a huge factor in this war and something that I believe is downplayed a hell of a lot. Now, this is the NATO Military Committee Chair Rob Bauer speaking recently.
I'm absolutely sure if the Russians did not have nuclear weapons, we would have been in Ukraine, kicking them out. We would have. But they have nuclear weapons, so it's not the same as in Afghanistan.
So if the Russians didn't have nuclear weapons, we would have been in in Ukraine by we as NATO, kicking them out. And this is an important piece to add, is if Russia didn't have nukes, there would have been a deployment, but they do, so there's not. So we can see that these officials, I don't care what people on Twitter or Telegram say about other nukes, they're not going to work, or these red lines don't exist, or this or that. These guys who have access to classified information, they've been to these colleges, they are a lot more in-depth with military analysis and decisions, have come to the conclusion of, yeah, but this is still a real threat. If it wasn't a threat, there would have been a deployment. And this is where I will say, nuclear weapons, till this point in time, have saved significantly more lives than they have taken. Since the dropping of the first nuclear weapons, we have not seen a great state war. Plenty through proxy, but not a great state expansion of war. So this is what I saw underneath this from no reports, but of the top comment. That is ridiculously short-sighted, and it will destabilise the world. If nuclear weapons make countries above the law, that creates a ridiculous, perversive incentive that will cause everyone to acquire nuclear weapons, which will ironically bring us closer to nuclear war. Or it brings us further away because now everyone is holding a gun to each other's head. But nuclear weapons are a little bit like my mate who is 6'4", 6'5", and fucking built. If he gets in a fight somewhere or someone pushes him, it's not fair. He's treated differently in a pub, but it's just the way it is. And nuclear powers can operate differently to non-nuclear powers. And like I've said, is the only truly sovereign states are those who can initiate mutually assured destruction. Can make internal issues, and even if internal changes, and even if someone has a problem with that, no one is willing to take military action really directly against it. This is why we don't see complete military action against Russia. Like this guy said, if Russia didn't have those weapons, NATO would have deployed. And I'm sure there's other wars and other examples you can see where there would have been different involvement, but you're going against someone who is a nuclear power. Whether fair or not, it's the way of the world. The issue with this is, though, the issue with these countries holding nuclear weapons is nuclear weapons have brought around, I believe, a period of prosperity. So no major wars, and you see like America is in the moment. But what it can also do is it can breed injustice and protect radical governments too. And this is where the threat of Russia being able to supply these weapon systems to a country which the West may see as a rogue government, but that really protects it. I think America's biggest concern would be if Iran got modern ICBM missiles, how that would really level the unconventional battlefield within the Middle East. Anyway, Since dropping of 2 atom bombs, we've not had a great state war except for through proxies. Look at Afghanistan for the Soviets and Vietnam for the West. The more nuclear weapons seem to have the inverse effect on war, that you have less war, less deaths. But if there is a nuclear war, it will rise its cost 10 times or potentially 100 times or potentially what's the word I'm looking for? An extinction level event. The issue is a nuclear armed state is in a checkmate, and they're all sort of in gun to each other's head, checkmate. And this is why Iran and North Korea, of course, want to acquire these weapon systems, and why I've said that I believe Australia, if I was the leader, that is what I'd look to acquire due to some unfriendly, more powerful nations that may be looking at Australia. And why I believe this has come up about Ukraine looking potentially to acquire nuclear weapons, because they're like, well, if we have a gun the other way to the head, it may just go into a full cessation if you're not willing to protect us under some sort of Article 5. So let's talk through this article here about Zelensky's nuclear option. Ukraine months away from bomb, that Kyiv could rapidly develop a rudimentary weapon similar to that dropped in Nagasaki. Nuclear weapon if Donald Trump withdraws US military assistance. The country would quickly be able to build a basic device from plutonium with a similar technology to the Fat Man bomb dropped on Nagasaki in 1945. Creating a simple atomic bomb, it would not be a difficult task 80 years from this point in time, except politically it would be incredibly difficult. With no time to build and run, and the centrifuges, things like this would be still difficult too. With no time to build and run large facilities requires enriched uranium, wartime Ukraine would have to rely instead on using plutonium extracted from spent fuel rods taken from Ukraine's nuclear reactors. The problem is this would then definitely turn these into legitimate military targets, and I believe the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is looking over a lot of these areas, would have something definite to say about this. But of course, the problem in this is going to be the NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. I've written 69 here, but I believe it is 68. But this treaty aims to prevent and spread aims to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons and nuclear weapon technology to countries that don't already possess them. So the 5 countries that do possess them, we don't want more. Now, there are ones outside of this, yes, from the original of this, but they don't want too many around the world to limit that and the tech. China, France, Russia, the UK, and the US. The hard truth is Ukraine would be sanctioned for this if they went down this path, I believe. This also greatly increases the risk of Russia using a far more deadly system like a nuclear weapon, which is far more advanced than Kyiv could make, through a de-escalation through escalation. Now, we do know there is doctrine around this. You escalate so far, you cause your enemy to de-escalate. Very similar to the whole mindset behind dropping the bombs on Japan. Was you escalate to such a level, it causes de-escalation. And depending how you look at it, you could argue that that worked. The war against Japan, they then surrendered. Ukraine still controls 9 operational reactors and has significant nuclear expertise despite having given up the third world's largest nuclear arsenal in 1996. The report says the weight of reactor plutonium available to Ukraine can be estimated at 7 tons. A significant nuclear weapons arsenal would require much less material. The amount of material is sufficient for hundreds of warheads with a tactical yield of several kilotons. The problem for Ukraine is going to also be the delivery system and other bits around this and the development as well if they wanted to go down this. Such a bomb would have about 1/10 the power of Fat Man. I actually believe it to be about 1/3. I believe the Fat Man was about 21 kilotons, but I could be incorrect. The RS-28 Sarmat, Russia's ICBM or Satan II, is 50 megatons, not kilotons, megatons. Now, this makes it about 2,400 times more powerful. But what they say about if they were able to make these warheads, that it would be enough to destroy entire Russia airbase or concentrated military, industrial or logistic installations. The exact nuclear yield would be unpredictable because it would use different isotopes of plutonium. Again, the author of this report, Oleksiy Yizhak, is head of department at Ukraine's National Institute of Strategic Studies, a government research centre that acts as an advisory body to the Presidential Office and the National Security and Defence Council of Ukraine. So it's not just some random dude writing up a paper. But this here, it would be enough to destroy entire Russian air bases, but would it be enough then for Russia to go, well, we're going to drop a 50 megaton one somewhere else? Or is it going to be that checkmate just sitting in that, and it's just a gridlock at that point? The plutonium would need to be imploded using a complicated conventional explosion design that the detonation would simultaneously around the entire surface of the plutonium sphere. You can have a look at like Oppenheimer or something. You can sort of see that the technology is challenging, but with Ukraine's expertise, but within Ukraine's expertise, I can't speak on that whether it is or is not. We know Ukraine had a very large strategic arsenal that went back to the Russian Soviet owned, went back there in 96 to 94, 96, worked things out. We will see. Last month, President Zelensky said he had told Trump that Ukraine would need nuclear weapons to guarantee his country's security if it were prevented from joining NATO, as President Putin has demanded. So Putin, of course, has said we don't want Ukraine in NATO. NATO is not extending out to Ukraine at this point in time. And what Zelensky's basically said is, well, then we're going to have to seek nuclear weapons for some sort of security guarantee. Later, Zelensky said he meant there was no alternative security guarantee, and Ukrainian officials have since denied Kyiv is considering nuclear rearmament. Again, I wouldn't be ever completely saying that there is not this chance on the horizon for any countries, and I've spoken about Australia. The paper, which was published by the Centre for Army, Conversation and Disarmament Studies, an influential Ukrainian military think tank, has been shared with the country's Deputy Defence Minister and is to be presented on Wednesday at a conference likely to be attended by Ukraine's Ministers for Defence and Strategic Industries. Again, not just some guy out there writing up studies. It is not endorsed by the Kyiv government, but sets out the legal basis under which Ukraine could withdraw from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, and the ratification of which was contingent on the security guarantees given by the US, UK and Russia on the 1994 Budapest Memorandum. The agreement stated that Ukraine would surrender its nuclear arsenals of over 1,700 strategic warheads in exchange for the promise of protection. What I will say too was Ukraine in the mid-90s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, was in a very different spot to what it is now as well, and stability. But even then, the stability and nuclear warheads here, there would be further concern from friendly allied governments there too. What I've said, and I'll say it again, Germany's not willing to give Taurus. The UK is not willing to sign off a Storm Shadow back in. It's going to look very different if you try and then make a nuclear warhead. But again, if NATO step away, I do see this as probably some level of guarantee for security. Maybe. I can see what he's getting at here. The violation of the memorandum by the nuclear-armed Russian Federation provides formal grounds, he says, for withdrawal from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and moral reasons for reconsideration of the non-nuclear choice made in early 1994. So basically saying that because Russia has violated this, therefore there's no formal grounds for us. It provides formal grounds, for us to withdraw out of something like this. But again, where Russia can escalate, it doesn't have to be here. It can be by providing Iran, North Korea, or China. People will never, because they just assume everything China has is better than the Russians. There are certain bit of equipments that China is really looking for from tech from the Russians. Nuclear delivery systems and warheads is one of those things. And it is a slippery slope, which is not, I believe, in the interest of the US. Particularly, we see Elon Musk's fear towards this and how Trump has spoken of this also. Russian troops are gaining momentum as they advance in the Donbass region of eastern Ukraine. Trump has pledged to cut US military aid unless Kyiv submits to peace talks. This isn't very true. He's either going to increase aid if Putin won't stop, or decrease aid if that no one is willing to come to the table. He just wants an end for the guns to fall silent. Ukrainian forces are heavily dependent on US weaponry, and the reduction of flow of Western arms into the country, let alone complete curtailment, would have catastrophic consequences on the battlefield. That has prompted Ukrainians to look for a way to take matters into their own hands. You need to understand we face an existential challenge. The thing is, what Russia will say if you were to develop this, particularly if you were to use one, Russia's first strike policy of nuclear weapons is a threat to the existence of the Russian state. They may see that, and the next thing we don't want is this chain reaction of events going down and 1 billion people dead. Again, we see the NATO rhetoric is that it's existential to NATO as well. That's the rhetoric. The way that NATO gives arms, gives policy to Ukraine to use those arms within Russia, that in reality does not match the rhetoric that these NATO politicians are saying about the existential nature of this war towards NATO. Western experts believe it would take Ukraine at least 5 years to develop a nuclear weapon and a suitable carrier. But Badak insists Ukraine in less than a year from building its own ballistic missiles. In 6 months, Ukraine will be able to show that it has a long-range ballistic missile capabilities with a range of 1,000 Ks. Again, but this isn't a deliverable nuclear system. Could still be years away. I don't believe this war has years in it. This bloke, former commanding officer at UK's joint CBRN regiment, told Times Radio, Ukraine certainly had the technical know-how and practice wherewithal to produce a nuclear weapon. Trump will take note because the last thing we want is more nuclear proliferation and any sort of nuclear strike in Europe, be it from the Ukrainians or the Russians. And Trump would be very hard on that too. He calls Zelensky a master strategist who is willing to try absolutely everything except for dropping that mobilization from 18 to 18, I guess. But like I've said, if you think Germany won't allow Taurus, try if you're trying to develop a nuclear weapon. At the moment, it's quite hard to talk about nuclear weaponry when we have so much other weaponry we're asking for is repelling the Russian constant threat. So yeah, there's so many other systems before this could be to give Ukraine more help on the battlefield. They argue that should the US abandon Ukraine, Britain could honour its security obligation under the Budapest Memorandum and help Ukraine develop a nuclear deterrent, given it does not have the conventional means to prevent Russia from overrunning Ukraine. So basically saying if the US abandon, the UK will step up. What I will say, the UK is looking to America for permission to use a medium-range cruise missile of the Storm Shadow, which are in smaller numbers, within Russia. They're looking to US for permission for their weapons system, their control, whatever. Do you think that the UK is then going to, if they're not willing to do that for Storm Shadow, you think they're going to do this for a nuclear weapon? Not a hope in hell. The last thing either you need is massive division within NATO. That's not good for anyone. He believes the threshold for developing a nuclear rearmament program would be Putin's troops reaching the city of Pavlograd, a military industrial hub 60 miles from the present front line, so 100 Ks back. Any further, there would be risk of some of Ukraine's largest cities, as Dnipro, Kharkiv could fall before the weapon was developed. So he's talking Pavlograd up here, the threat for Zap, Dnipro, and Kharkiv, if that were to happen. I was surprised by the reverence of the United States has for Russia's nuclear threat. It may have cost us the war. They treat nuclear weapons as some kind of god. So perhaps it is also time for us to pray to this god. What I will say is nuclear weapons are the only wonder weapons that exist. And you're surprised by the reverence the US has for Russia's nuclear threat? I'm not. Russia is the largest deliverable nuclear arsenal in the world and constantly threats this as well. And some of their doctrine uses it more in a tactical sense than a strategic sense. You need to take that on board. And the US has said recently that there was real threat at some points from this. So we need to take that into account too. May it have cost the war? Yes. May have it stepped out of a nuclear war? Maybe yes as well. We'll never truly know what went on in those backroom discussions. The US, better than anyone, or maybe not as well as Japan, but the US better than anyone, know that nuclear weapons are some level of god wonder weapon too. So I'm not surprised at all that America is incredibly concerned about this further escalation here as well. It's the last thing, like they say, that anyone wants is nuclear weapons being lobbed around. Now, because this has got some heat, a spokesman for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine has shared this, or I don't know what it's called on X, where you reply to something. Ukraine is committed to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. We do not possess, develop, or intend to acquire nuclear weapons. Ukraine works closely with the International Atomic Energy Agency and is fully transparent to its monitoring, which rules out the use of nuclear materials for military purposes. Saying there's no intention of any of this, but this paper is going to be presented. And in the future, I'd never really rule it out. I've spoken about if I was the Australian leader, it is the one thing I'd look at for being a smaller country with a smaller military, smaller economy, with a very large country who may not be friendly to you, close-ish in your region, Australia's case, regardless. But this is something I've shared before about Kursk, about if it was like a professional gamer speaking about the tactics in his game that I got sent. I have no idea about the game, but one of my guys sent it to me. He said this could be very relevant, especially when it came to those initial weeks of Kursk. But if you're losing, if your opponent is stronger and pushing you back on the main battlefield, and you don't know what to do, make it messy. Make the war zone messy. Stop focusing on the main battlefield. Try attacking your opponent in their home base. Maybe they don't have much military over there. maybe they get confused or start panicking or making mistakes. Maybe you get a chance to turn the tide and win the game. So if you're losing, you've got to take some big risks. I think that's what Kursk was on as well. We're seeing like a Ukrainian car bomb, we presume a Ukrainian car bomb, kill a Russian naval commander down in Crimea today. So maybe we will see more messiness of this. Could we see things like dirty bombs of development of nuclear weapons? Again, I don't know. I think the political fallout that could have on Ukraine is not worth it for Ukraine. If other countries step away from this, it's going to have more problems. I think the most likely use of any nuclear thing in this whole war will be a false flag event. Maybe it'll be a strike on Kursk's nuclear power plant in Russia. Go look at what Ukraine has done and then try and get support withdrawn. Or maybe a strike on Russian-occupied plant in Zap, and that then the Ukraine's got to look at what Russia has done and try and get more support in. I think if we're going to see nuclear, not weapons use, but nuclear as a sort of scary word around the world to try and get more involvement or step away, that's more likely than development or use case of actual bombs. So let's talk about this negotiation that Advisor to President Zelensky, Mikhailo Podolyak, has said. Let's set some very basic accents correctly. Forcing Ukraine to negotiate on any unfavourable terms, about which the Western media constantly publish marvellous insights, looks extremely strange. But what I say here is, forcing Ukraine to negotiate on favourable terms, it's up to Ukraine to put themselves in a more favourable position along with its allies. The thing that Ukraine can do is mobilisation, therefore Western support, and potentially battlefield wins to put themselves in then a more favourable position for that negotiation to take place. Because in essence, they propose to force Ukraine to give up its resistance. They do not discuss real scenarios for forcing Russia, the aggressor, to stop aggression. Thing is, I don't see what real scenario to stop Russia has been brought forward. The victory plan does not give a real scenario to that of we're going to mobilise 500,000, they're going to be trained and we'll be pushing Russia back in these areas. And for Russia to pay the maximum financial and legal price for aggression. Why? And because what absurd moral imperative is this? The peace at the expense of the victim only, of the country that was attacked, and the expense of openly incentivising the aggressor to continue aggression, because there will be no need to pay anything for this aggression. Where does this come from, and why should this strange construct of strange construct lead to peace? But not to scaling up of aggression, but the final humiliation of international law. So if this is allowed to happen, it will be humiliating to international law, and it will reward aggression, showing that might is right. But I believe he's somewhat off in this. And what I'll say is people will go, anyone talking about negotiations, anyone saying that is the way forward, they're working for Putin, they want the aggressor to win this and this and this. No, there may be definitely some saying that, but I believe the many who are saying this, the majority who are saying this, agree that Ukraine is the victim of this war. But what they're saying is Ukraine has been, at least on the frontline maps, is showing that Ukraine is losing slowly. And without either massive commitment from NATO and massive internal willingness and commitment from Ukraine of mass mobilisation, mass armament, policy shift, extension of war years, negotiation is the only way to go ahead if you're not willing to do that. So there's two options here. That years more of war, massive armament, massive mobilisation, or negotiation. It's got to be one or the other. And I think people saying, well, if you're floating in this, you're not willing to drop that mobilisation age, America's not willing to give more arms, is the best option here for ending suffering in areas, is it that. It doesn't make someone a Putin or Kremlin shill. It doesn't mean that they're saying that what they're doing is correct. It's saying, well, you need to be realistic about the situation, and we don't see any steps being made to get out of that situation also. So we need to look at recruiting. Of course, Russia hasn't announced another mobilisation, although many people every couple of months say that there's about to be one. There hasn't been. We know that numbers pouring into this need to be very large for the losses that Ukraine and Russia are taking, and that replacement to continue rolling. The Deathonomics powering Russia's war machine. Going to war is now a rational economic choice in Russia's impoverished hinterlands. Russia is offering higher salaries and bonuses to entice new recruits. In some of the poorest regions, the military wage is as much as 5 times the average, probably a lot more, and they receive large compensations from the governments if they're killed. Myself and history legends spoke about this. These are life-changing sums for those who have left behind. The purchase payment power, whatever it's called, the PPP, was around $250,000 USD. You'd be very surprised at what people would do for that amount of money. I've seen some weird shit go online for a lot less money than that. Killed on the battlefield will receive around this amount of money in death compensation. But again, you need to look at the parity of how much that dollar's actually worth. That would have earned cumulative working as a civilian until the age of 60. So that's more than working that whole life. Some people see this as like a way to set their family ahead. Going to the front and being killed in a year is economically more profitable than a man's further life. A phenomenon that this guy calls deathonomics. This is why Russia is having so many guys then come up to sign up and having recruits instead of mobilization. So many soldiers are having killed, the payments totaling as much as 30 billion USD in the past year as of June. They're telling the symptom of how the war is transforming Russian society and economy at large. Since the start of the invasion, the Kremlin has boosted military spending to post-Soviet high. So post-Soviet high was a lot more, about around double the height of what it is at the moment, offsetting some of the impact of Western sanctions, weapons factory work around the clock, providing employment and high wages. The thing is, things like this are really good until it falls apart, if it falls apart. In war, there's more money to be made than ever. It's like World War I entered with X amount of millionaires, left with like 5 times. Now the mounting death payments are providing an injection of wealth onto some of the Russia's poorest areas in return for a steady stream of soldiers for the war effort. Poverty levels are now at their lowest since data collection began in 1995. According to official statistics, perceptions of what it means to join the military have been transformed. There's support for the war, support for Putin, and this is it might be hard to get your head around, but we saw similar to this like in Afghanistan. We went to do some stuff with this General Sharif. We weren't involved in what deals are being made between the US and himself, but we were there as security. But this guy's known as Kabul Butcher. Everyone's like, this is not a good guy. But he stops the Taliban in this like valley and therefore stops them onto this edge of Kabul. And he's covered like running water, education to people here. This guy's not a good guy. But if you were to eliminate him, it could fall into shambles. There's a lot of support in the community for him, even if in their heart of hearts they know he's not a good guy. But if he's supplying higher wages than ever, that poverty is reducing, you're going to get a lot of support there. From outside looking in, it's very easy to judge. But the war in Ukraine has transformed the fortunes of those willing to fight, boosting not just their income, but their social status, so making it like a pride thing to fight also. Since the start of the war, Russia has suffered over 600,000 casualties, including killed and wounded, according to Western estimates. Again, with these numbers, you don't know because, of course, Ukraine is saying that over 700,000 have been killed, what would mean near 2 million have been, as far as actually WIA, KIA, and we don't know the MIA to try and get around how expensive this is as well. With this number, it would mean about 200,000 have been killed and 400,000 wounded. To offset these losses and incentivize recruitment, the government soldiers fighting in Ukraine a minimum monthly salary of 210,000 rubles or $2,100, substantially higher than the national average of 75,000 rubles. And it can be a hell of a lot more than this. There are guys that were getting paid well over $10,000 or $15,000 in some of these jobs too. But if we take what they said before, that 150,000 like death payment, all of this, and including salaries and whatever, and insurances, you can see 30 billion divided by 150k turns out to about 200,000, which actually lines up pretty close to this figure in here. Again, any numbers is impossible to get. I believe that there's going to be in Russia and Ukraine a lot of guys put down as missing in action because of how expensive. You're looking at this $30 billion. Ukraine has a massive death payout too, and both Russia and Ukraine do not have an infinite amount of money. I think there's going to be a lot put as MIA to avoid some of that too. The result is Russia is currently able to recruit around 1,000 men a day, which is a insane amount. Payment increases will probably bolster recruitment levels for the remainder of the year, but losses remain staggeringly high. The head of Britain's armed forces told the BBC on Sunday that Russian forces averaged 1,500 casualties a day throughout October. Now again, casualties is killed, wounded, everything in between. Now, again, how many of these guys are returning to the battlefield? Is this a net positive, net negative? We don't know. Again, with any of these figures, it's impossible to get an idea. One of the stark examples of war transform Russian lives is in Buryatia, a mountainous part of eastern Siberia that is so geographically distant from the Russian capital. Many residents consider themselves close to identity to parts of North Mongolia and their region borders. The mobilization drive, announced September 22, caused social upheaval in Buryatia, which has sent tens of thousands of men to fight in Ukraine, which of at least 1,700 have died. But they talk about, with the obituaries of the men who died on the battlefield, the deaths are largely accepted, says this person here, a political researcher, and now runs an organisation that advocates for democracy in the region. Saying we expected the number of bodies returning home to Buryatia would cause people to start protesting the war. But it's had the opposite effect. The massive wealth accumulation in this poverty-stricken region may help explain why. In 22, bank deposits in Buryatia were up 81%. This year, residential construction was up 32% compared with an national average of 2%. That goes back into what I spoke about before, where you'd think there may be a protest. It can go the opposite way. And this has been where this war has become sort of this, in Russia, sold as though now existential, that all of that can have influence with money, with everything, to get more people. So I do believe that Russia is very likely taking very high losses, but I believe they're probably bolstering and she being able to buffer that as well. 50-year-old resident from this village, just 25 miles from the border of Mongolia, lost her son and husband in the war. She says 5 other men from the village have died in Ukraine. She had spent years saving up to buy an apartment for her family in the regional capital of Ulan-Ude. The payments she received for the men's deaths made it possible to buy 2 apartments there, as well as a car for her daughter, Elenia. And again, like we've spoken about, there are men, fathers, looking at this as I may die, but it may give generational wealth to my struggling family. Again, these areas are insanely poor. It's very easy in a Western country, especially like Australia, a very wealthy Western country, to go, oh, why would anyone do that? You're not faced with this amount of poverty. Same as judging Afghanis for trying to step onto the fucking control surfaces of a C-17. It's hard to judge from outside going in. In Ukraine, mobilization will be extended next year. This announcement was made by Defence Minister Rustem Umerov during his speech at the annual general meeting of the European Business Association in 24, saying next year, in order to maintain defence, in order to implement all the goals and objectives that were specified in the military strategy, we must continue mobilisation. So more mobilisation next year for Ukraine. This is a different article, by the way. As the minister explained, his department gives recommendations on how many people need to be mobilised to hold the front and have strategic and operational reserves. We're trying to change the paradigm so that service is an honour and not how society perceives it now. Bussification, and that the territorial guard and the recruitment is very bad, and the training is poor as well, and a very problematic issue for us. See where these wars are seen differently for that payment, funding, and mobilisation. There's a real struggle going on here for men. Those liable for military service who are mobilised from November 1 will undergo 45 days of military training at training centres. Previously, such training lasted 30 days. Now, from my experience as a former infantryman, this is not long enough, not even close to long enough. I think maybe 3 months, maybe 90 days for defensive-only operations. I couldn't see anything less than 6 months, and the attritional warfare doctrine backs this up. This is built off my experience and reading of attritional warfare offensive doctrines. Minimum of 6 months training to actually be able to conduct mechanised manoeuvre assaults. Absolutely. Now, look, this is getting long in the tooth. I'm going to talk about this part tomorrow, but yeah, legends, thanks for everything. Thanks for looking after me. I'll speak more on this stuff that's going on with my health at some other point. I'm not up to it at the moment. Everything's fine. Don't worry about that. It's just, I just can't be bothered heading into that long of treatment. Anyway, I'll speak to you soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.